Hello and welcome to today's summary webinar talking about demand-side flexibility for DSOs. We're giving you some highlights of a 45-minute webinar we held recently with a few hundred of our network. On today's webinar, we've got three of us sharing our insights with you. My name is John Slow and I've got my colleagues Matt and Tom who led this research with me. So this is a way in which we can share some highlights from our research, which is a multi-client study, which we carried out over the last few months, looking into the leading edge of innovation in how DSOs across Europe are using demand-side flexibility to operate their networks. We're going to cover 5 key points in the next 12 minutes or so to give you some highlights from our research, which we hope you find interesting. First question, why DSOs are turning to demand-side flexibility? Well, as distributed generation grows, as electrification of transport and heat grows, as more batteries appear on the network, networks are getting harder to manage. And rather than build bigger networks to cope with that, there's more and more interest in using demand-side flexibility as a cheaper, quicker tool to manage network constraints and network challenges, either capacity or faults or combinations of both. So we'll be looking at some of those ways. And in terms of where we're looking, you can see that UK from this map is furthest ahead, where some DSOs are commercially procuring demand-side flexibility today. We've highlighted the Netherlands as probably the next in line, where there's some early commercial activity, but lots of trials and activity across other countries in Europe as well. And the differences are sometimes due to network constraints, sometimes due to the approach to innovation amongst these network companies, but very often due to regulation. Now, we held a poll on our webinar and we had lots of responses to the poll in terms of how long it will take for DSOs to use demand-side flexibility in business as usual. And we gave people on our webinar these choices. The answers were very interesting. 3/4 approximately thought that it would be business as usual within the next 5 years. We think maybe that's a little optimistic, but the clear direction of travel, or the direction of travel is very clear, that DSOs are going to be using demand-side flexibility more and more in the next years. The UK is leading partly due to regulation, and the regulator here has actually made it neutral to the DSOs whether they build a bigger transformer, for example, or whether they procure demand-side flexibility. So they can effectively put that demand-side flexibility contract into their asset base in the same way they would put a bigger substation into their asset base. Now, the UK regulation is probably leading Europe, but the rest of Europe is following, driven by the EU's clean energy package, which is driving regulation in the same direction. So I think this backs up the view we saw in the poll, that this will become more and more widespread. So I'd like to bring my colleague Matt into the discussion now. Hello, Matt.
Hi everyone.
Matt, this slide, you use on this slide a way of showing that DSOs are using it as a short-term alternative rather than network critical resource at the moment. Can you just explain in a sentence or two what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. I think just to make it clear, I mean, while some DSOs have started with the commercial procurement of Flex, as we've been saying, there are no DSOs that currently use demand-side flexibility as what we would kind of call a distribution system critical resource. The space is just a bit too new and the market is still developing. So from all the conversations that we had with DSOs from across Europe, kind of 3 main things came up is in terms of the way that they're using or planning to use demand-side flexibility in the short term. And I mean, the first one I have there on the slide, John, is around helping bridge decision gaps and act as kind of a safety net while new kit is being designed and built. Another reason given by the DSOs was demand-side flexibility is great in a case where demand is currently high, but is expected to fall or is currently falling, such as factories or commercial operations shutting down. And then lastly, another good use case for the DSOs, what they're seeing is that it will help maximize the lifetime of existing assets. So in an example where a substation is just a few years away from the end of its life, rather than scrap it early due to rising demand, you can extend its deployment.
Okay, so you're seeking every bit of use you can out of the current traditional assets.
Yeah.
I think this quote I found really interesting. So you can see here one of the UK DNOs, as they're called here in the UK, really sees that demand-side flexibility could be a big part of their future. And we've developed a hierarchy you can see on the right here. So Matt, this is really a traditional hierarchy, isn't it? And the arrows show that flexibility may become more widely used.
Yeah, if anything, I would say this pyramid probably closely reflects the way a lot of the kind of continental DSOs see the space at the moment. And certainly from what we're hearing, and especially the developments in the UK, I think it's safe to say we see flexibility procurement, which is currently near the top of this pyramid, so not as critical, definitely making its way down the kind of the pyramid, as in becoming more important, becoming more fundamental to the way that the DSO runs and kind of operates their network.
Thanks, Matt. And I think in GB here, the regulator's got a mantra, if I can use that word, of flexibility first. So before you build a bigger asset, network asset, can you use flexibility to solve that problem? We looked at a lot of different companies active in demand-side flexibility with DSOs. Matt, we categorize them in 3 groups here. Can you just explain that briefly?
Yeah, sure. So in the space, yeah, broadly 3 different groups. We've got, of course, the distribution system operators, which a lot would say are really at the heart of what's going on. We then have the platform providers. So these are not in all cases, but sometimes private companies, sometimes kind of partnerships amongst the DSOs to kind of facilitate bringing demand-side flexibility to the markets. And then, of course, lastly, we have the flexibility providers themselves, which in a lot of the case are aggregators. But I don't want to give away too much. I think Tom is going to say a few words on that in a few slides' time.
Okay, thanks, Matt. So we'll take a look at one, which is Western Power Distribution. We characterize that as the most successful DSO in Europe in terms of the megawatts you can see in this table. So they procured a lot of flexibility, maybe small in comparison to the total demand they serve across their network. Matt, we're interested in them because of these 4 reasons. Can you just tell us a bit more about the USP that we see that Western Power Distribution has in this area?
Sure, yeah. WPD certainly are quite advanced in this space compared to a lot of the other DSOs we've looked at, and they're developing capabilities on multiple fronts. I mean, they've got their own flexible power platform. They've also been working with Piccolo Flex, which is another platform provider, and they've also got the Centrica LEM, which has been in the press lately, also operating on a part of their network down in Cornwall. So they really are working across a lot of different areas. WPD also been signposting their needs in terms of demand-side flex quite far out and doing a lot of reforecasting, so really keeping the market up to date. And in terms of the platform that they've developed themselves, their flexible power platform, we really see this as an industry first in the way that it uses APIs to essentially digitally dispatch and meter the procured flexibility assets. And lastly, I think their flexible contracts that they offer, so being in the 1 to 4 year range, is also great in terms of helping the market develop.
Thanks, Matt. And I think that's where we've seen a lot of learning is how do you contract that flexibility, and some of the DSOs at the leading edge learning about how to get that balance right in terms of risk and reward for the providers of flexibility. It's a very dynamic space, and we've seen WPD identify the need to do more. So you can see here some of their next steps and challenges that they're looking to take. So while we've been looking to capture that leading edge is moving a lot of the time, and we think will continue to move over the next years. So We identified 9 challenges. We won't go through them all now, but you can see them on this slide. So these are developed bottom up from the research we carried out. Matt, can you just add a bit of colour to the first challenge that we've got top of the list there, that lack of market liquidity?
Yeah, sure. So certainly one of the kind of the main or most common complaints by a lot of the parties we spoke to was the current lack of market liquidity, and that it is currently difficult to find providers of flexibility in the right location for a reasonable price. And very briefly, 3 main contributing factors here. The first one is the location-specific nature of constraints. It's such a big challenge. We've discussed it separately. You can see it appears number 2 in our table. The next contributing factor is just the fact that the market is a bit immature and standard terms and conditions are still being developed. And then lastly, another contributing factor are the investment decision time lags present in the space. So basically, even if I'm a provider of flexibility and I've taken the decision that, this is a space I want to get involved in, it does take time to deploy assets and develop the necessary capabilities, whether that be digital or kind of hardware.
Thanks very much, Matt. So we asked our webinar attendees another question here about where the flexibility will come from in 5 years' time. And I think we got a fascinating answer, a real mix of some people thinking that commercial and industrial assets would dominate, whilst another chunk thinking residential assets would dominate, and maybe a pragmatic third or so thinking it will be a mix. So a lot of different views about where the flexibility will come from. Now, Tom, bringing you in at this stage, we've got 2 things on this slide. On the left, the main group of companies providing that flexibility, and that's still aggregators today?
It is, yeah. It's looking mainly at a UK context, but as it is now, most DSO flexibility is procured still via an aggregator. Aggregators do represent a range of companies, most aggregating large devices on behalf of C&I users.
So looking at the right-hand side here, this is showing the assets that most of those aggregators are using today. Will you just run us through that order?
Sure, yeah. So as you can see from the top of the diagram, most assets are providing flexibility from generators, a large portion of which are diesel gensets.
So these are backup generators at hospitals or universities and so on?
That's right, and they're providing turn-up generally rather than turn-down services.
Mm-hmm. And then after that?
So a large proportion as well is provided by batteries, mainly of larger capacity. And then you have some turned down from C&I industrial loads, but that's further down the list. And then domestic assets currently provide a very small proportion, but have a lot of potential in this space, but especially if you include electric heating and EVs.
Yeah. Okay, so we expect them to grow. So that will change over time. And then the DSO platforms, we've characterized them, as you can see, by 5 different aspects or functionalities of the platform. Tom, some of that is short-term and some of that's long-term, as you can see at the bottom of this slide. So long-term might be planning years ahead. What might short-term be, Tom?
So short-term would be focused on exchange, and that would be generally those platforms that are focused on shorter term exchange are integrated more with current markets. So you might have the intraday or wholesale markets that they're interfacing with.
Okay, and I think that's a really important aspect we found, was that some platforms and some DSOs are just looking at their part of the value chain, whereas other platforms are trying to integrate flexibility for DSOs with the TSO or even with electricity markets.
That's right. I think a lot of the platforms are looking to develop additional sort of integrational functionality in future.
Thanks, Tom. So there's lots in the report. You get a snapshot here of what we've put together. If you've got questions about that, we'd love to hear from you. And you can get in touch with us via our website, via our colleague Rita, who would be delighted to talk to you, or by downloading the brochure from the URL that you can see. So that was a very quick canter through our research. Thanks, Matt and Tom, for sharing some of those highlights. And we hope that you found that of interest. Goodbye.